Genghis Khan. Before Temujin became Genghis Khan, the Mongolian steppe was a place where survival was measured in seasons, not decades. Rival clans raided one another constantly, stealing horses, women, and children, selling captives into slavery without ceremony. Temujin knew this world personally. As a boy, his father was poisoned by Tatar enemies, leaving his family abandoned by their own clan to starve on the steppe. He watched his mother forage for roots and berries to keep her children alive. As a young man, he was captured by a rival clan and forced to wear a kangi, a wooden restraint device locked around the neck, before escaping in the dark. Personal brutality was not something Temujin learned from books or from court advisors. It was something the steppe burned into him before he was old enough to grow a beard. And when he finally had the power to direct that brutality outward, he did so with a systematic thoroughness that no conqueror before or since has quite matched at scale. His first great act of organized slaughter was against the Tatars, the people responsible for his father's death. After defeating them militarily, he assembled the surviving Tatar men and ordered every male taller than the linchpin of a cart axle to be executed on the spot. The measurement was precise and deliberate. Boys too young to reach that height would grow up Mongol. Everyone else was killed. This policy was not rage. It was policy, recorded in the secret history of the Mongols, the closest thing to a primary source the Mongol world produced. And it tells you everything about how Temujin's mind worked. Extermination was a tool, applied with the same logic you would apply to clearing a field before planting. His military innovations were equally cold-blooded in their design. He reorganized the traditional Mongol tribal structure into a decimal system of units, tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s, commanded by officers loyal to him personally, rather than to their birth clan, which meant that the army that conquered half the known world was also an instrument for dismantling the social order that might have produced rival leaders. His campaigns against the Jurchen Jin dynasty on the northern edges of China produced destruction so total that the Persian chronicler Juvayni, writing decades later, described travelers approaching the ruins of once great cities and smelling the stench of the dead from miles away. The capital Zhongdu, taken in 1215, burned for weeks, but it was the Khwarezmian Empire campaign, launched in 1219, that defined his legacy in the blood-soaked terms that still echo across the historical record. The Khwarezmian Shah had made the fatal mistake of executing Mongol trade envoys and then a second diplomatic mission. Two acts that Genghis Khan treated as declarations of war, requiring a response so overwhelming that no one would ever need to be taught the lesson twice. Samarkand, one of the great cities of the medieval world, fell and was looted of its wealth, while its population was counted, sorted, and either conscripted, enslaved, or killed depending on their utility. The Khwarezmian capital resisted for months before being dismantled building by building, with the Amu Darya River reportedly redirected through the ruins. Merv, which had been one of the largest cities in the world, was taken in 1221 and its population was marched out in organized groups and systematically killed over multiple days. Contemporary sources, acknowledging their tendency toward the dramatic, place the death toll at over 1 million. Modern historians reject that specific figure, but agree the destruction was functionally total. The account that lingers most, sourced from both Juvayni and the later historian Rashid al-Din, involves the city of Nishapur, where a Mongol general and son-in-law of Genghis had been killed by an arrow during the siege. When the city finally fell, Genghis's daughter reportedly demanded that not one living creature be left alive inside its walls, that even the dogs and cats be killed, so that no living thing could take comfort in what had been her husband's killer's city. Whether the account is literally true or the kind of story that accumulated around these events like scar tissue, the underlying reality is not disputed. Nishapur was emptied of life. Genghis Khan's internal logic was never random. Cities that surrendered promptly were often absorbed in text and left with their infrastructure intact. Cities that resisted became warnings. The warning was legible across thousands of miles of the Islamic world, and it was written in the ash of places that no longer existed. Scholarly estimates of total deaths attributable to the Mongol conquests under Genghis range from 15 to 40 million, a figure whose enormous spread reflects both the genuine uncertainty of medieval population records and the sheer scale of what happened. Whatever the true number, the world he left behind when he died in 1227 was measurably emptier than the one he had entered. Ögedei Khan. Ögedei Khan does not get nearly enough credit for almost ending European civilization as a functioning entity, and the only reason he did not finish the job is that he died before he could. The second great Khan, son of Genghis, is often described in historical summaries as an administrator, a drunk, a man who kept the empire running while more dramatic figures grabbed the attention. That framing is accurate as far as it goes, and stops far too short. Under Ögedei's direction, the Mongol armies achieved something that no military military force in history had managed before. A simultaneous two-front invasion of Europe conducted with such precise coordination across such vast distances that the medieval kingdoms receiving the blows had no framework for understanding what was hitting them. The destruction of the Rus principalities came first. City after city across what is now Ukraine and Russia was taken and burned in the campaign of 1237 to 1240, with the Mongols moving through Russian winter conditions that European armies of the period considered impassable, because Ögedei's generals understood that frozen rivers were highways, not barriers. Vladimir fell, Ryazan fell, Moscow, then a minor town, fell. Kiev, which in 1240 was one of the most significant cities in Eastern Europe with an estimated population of 50,000 people, was reduced to near nothing. When the papal envoy John of Plano Carpini passed through the region in 1246, just 6 years after the attack, he described the road to Kiev as lined with skulls and bones, the ground itself rewritten by what had happened. He counted fewer than 200 houses still standing in what had been a major medieval capital. Then came Europe proper. On April 9th, 1241, a Mongol force under Baidar and Kadan crushed a combined Polish and German army at the Battle of Legnica, killing the Silesian Duke Henry II, and reportedly carrying his head on a pole around the walls of the city to frighten the defenders into surrendering. 2 days later, on April 11th, 1241, the main Mongol army under Batu Khan and the legendary general Subutai destroyed the Hungarian royal army at the Battle of Mohi, killing somewhere between 10,000 and 40,000 soldiers, and sending King Bela IV fleeing across the Adriatic Sea. That 2-day sequence, coordinated across hundreds of miles with no radio, no telegraph, and no technology beyond horseback riders and pre-planned timing, represented a level of military planning that no European power of the era could approach. Hungary was occupied for the better part of a year. Mongol scouting parties reportedly reached the outskirts of Vienna. The question of what came next was answered by Ögedei's death in December 1241, which triggered the mandatory Kurultai, the great assembly to choose a new Khan, requiring all senior Mongol leaders to return east. The army withdrew. Whether Europe was saved by geography, by Mongol supply line limitations, or simply by the accident of a man drinking himself to death in his palace in Karakorum is a question historians still debate. But that Ögedei's death ended the campaign is not disputed. His administrative brutality was quieter than his father's, but no less total. He institutionalized the census-based system that surveyed conquered populations and organized them for taxation, labor conscription, and military service, essentially converting entire nations into a managed resource. He also oversaw the construction of Karakorum as a permanent imperial capital, a city built by kidnapped craftsmen from China, Persia, and Europe, stocked with goods extracted from every corner of the empire, a physical monument to the idea that the Mongols were not a raiding force passing through, but a permanent fact of the world that subject peoples needed to accommodate indefinitely. The secret history records that even Genghis Khan lectured Ögedei about his drinking during his lifetime, which gives some sense of how severe it was. None of it slowed him down enough to matter during the years when the empire was at its most expansive, and the world was genuinely uncertain about where it would stop. Möngke Khan. Möngke Khan came to power in 1251 through a purge, and he understood that the way you take power in a fractured empire is also the way you keep it, which is by making the cost of opposition too high for anyone to calculate as worthwhile. The years between Ögedei's death in 1241 and Möngke's coronation were defined by vicious succession struggles among the Ögedei and Chagatai factions, with different branches of Genghis's enormous family tree maneuvering against one another in ways that would have consumed the empire entirely if left unchecked. Möngke, from the Tuluid branch, resolved the situation by arresting dozens of rival princes, nobles, and their household members, putting them through trials, and executing those found guilty of conspiring against him, a category that turned out to be conveniently large. Scores of people died in these purges, and the political structure of the empire was fundamentally reordered around Tuluids in a matter of months. Having secured the interior, Möngke turned outward with two of the most consequential campaigns in medieval history, directing his brother Hulagu westward against the remaining Islamic world, and personally leading campaigns against the Song dynasty in southern China. Hulagu's first major target was the Nizari Ismaili state, better known to Europeans as the Assassins, a network of mountain fortresses in Persia that had survived for over a century by making themselves too dangerous to attack directly. Hulagu systematically reduced their strongholds one by one throughout 1256, capturing the Grand Master Rukn al-Din Kursha, who was taken to Möngke's court and then executed after his usefulness as a hostage and guide ran out, reportedly killed in a manner that various sources describe differently, but none describe gently. Alamut, the greatest of the assassin fortresses, fell in November 1256, its famous library destroyed along with the political order it had defended. Then came Baghdad. In February 1258, Hulagu's forces entered the Abbasid capital, captured the Caliph al-Mustazim, and killed him, reportedly by wrapping him in felt and having horses trample him. A method chosen, according to tradition, because Mongol custom prohibited spilling royal blood on the open ground. Whether that specific account is accurate or legendary is uncertain, but the Caliph was unambiguously dead. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had existed for over 500 years as the symbolic center of Sunni Islamic civilization, was ended, and Baghdad itself was destroyed. Islamic chroniclers from the period describe the Tigris running black with ink from the manuscripts of the House of Wisdom thrown into the river, and red with blood alongside them. The figures they give for the dead range from 200,000 to 800,000, a spread that reflects both the chaos of the event and the trauma it left in collective memory. Modern historians accept that the destruction was catastrophic and the death toll enormous, while treating the specific numbers with appropriate skepticism. The destruction of Baghdad carried a symbolic weight beyond its immediate human cost. For the Sunni Muslim world, the Caliph was the successor to the Prophet, the spiritual and political figurehead around whom Islamic civilization oriented itself. His killing by pagan Mongols in a city that had been the intellectual capital of the Islamic world for 5 centuries was a civilizational rupture with no clean equivalent in Western historical experience. Möngke himself died in August 1259 at the siege of Diaoyu Fortress in Sichuan, during one of the rare Mongol campaigns that was not going well. The Song dynasty's river fortresses and defensive geography had stalled the eastern campaign, and dysentery or a wound from the siege. Accounts differ. Killed. The man who had come closer than anyone since Genghis to reuniting the world under a single Mongol hand. Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan is the Mongol ruler that history decided to make comfortable, largely because Marco Polo visited his court and wrote about it with unconcealed admiration, describing the Golden Palace at Khanbalik and the sophistication of Yuan dynasty administration with the enthusiasm of a man who had never seen anything like it, which he genuinely had not. The Kublai Khan of popular imagination is a patron of arts and trade, a cosmopolitan ruler who employed people of every religion and ethnicity, a man who received a Venetian merchant at his table and sent him home loaded with gifts. All of that is true, and none of it captures what it took to build and hold the empire he ran, the conquest of the Song dynasty. In it, the last major independent Chinese state was the longest and most costly campaign in Mongol history, stretching across decades of intermittent warfare from the 1230s through to the final and definitive end in 1279. The siege of Shenyang and its twin city Fandang, conducted from 1267 to 1273, lasted 5 full years and stalled the entire southern campaign. The Song had fortified the Han River crossing so effectively that conventional Mongol siege methods made no progress. Kublai's solution was to import Persian engineers capable of building counterweight trebuchets, the heavy artillery of the medieval world, devices that could hurl stones weighing over 100 kilograms at fortified walls with a precision and power that Chinese defensive engineers had not yet encountered. When those machines arrived and began operating, the cities fell within months, a demonstration that Kublai's willingness to adapt his methods to the problem at hand was as much a weapon as any. Catapult. The final chapter of the Song dynasty was written at the naval battle of Yemen in 1279, a massive engagement in the Pearl River Delta where the last Song loyalists, including the child emperor, made their final stand on a fleet of warships chained together into a floating fortress. When the Mongol navy broke through, the last Song minister reportedly threw himself into the sea carrying the child emperor in his arms, rather than allow capture. Contemporary accounts describe up to 100,000 people drowning or dying in the battle and its immediate aftermath: soldiers, sailors, court officials, and civilians who had followed the fleeing court to its end. The sea around Yemen was described as covered in floating bodies for days. Kublai's failures are equally instructive about the nature of his ambitions and the violence embedded in them. The 1274 invasion of Japan opened with the Mongol army landing on Tsushima Island and carrying out a massacre of its population before the typhoon that destroyed much of the fleet ended the campaign prematurely. The second invasion of 1281, far larger and more carefully planned, met the same meteorological fate. The storms the Japanese would call kamikaze, divine wind, and which modern archaeology has confirmed were genuinely catastrophic for the Mongol fleet. His invasion of Vietnam bogged down in jungle and disease. His campaign into Java achieved initial victories and then collapsed into an ambush. The pattern in the later campaigns was of enormous violence deployed in service of ambitions that the geography and logistics of the targets could not accommodate. Inside China, his governance institutionalized a legal and social hierarchy that placed Mongols at the top, then Central Asians, then Northern Chinese, then Southern Chinese at the bottom. bottom, a system backed by law and enforced by the state apparatus of the Yuan dynasty in ways that shaped Chinese society for generations after the dynasty itself was gone. Timur, known to the Persian and Arab world as Tamerlane, a corruption of Timuri Lang, meaning Timur the Lame, a reference to wounds he sustained either in battle or, according to some accounts, while raiding sheep as a young man, was not a Genghis Khan in the strict genealogical sense. He was a Turco-Mongol leader from Transoxiana who could not claim direct descent from Genghis Khan, and therefore could never formally use the title of Khan himself, ruling instead with the title of Emir and governing through a puppet Genghisid figurehead, none of which slowed him down at all. Timur understood the symbolic power of the Mongol imperial tradition better than most of the actual Genghisids of his era, and he carried out campaigns of destruction that would have made Genghis Khan recognize a kindred methodology. His towers of skulls are among the most visually documented acts of calculated terror in the pre-modern world. After taking Isfahan in 1387, a revolt by its citizens against his garrison prompted a response that was designed to be remembered. He ordered the construction of towers built from the heads of the city's massacred inhabitants. The Arab biographer Ibn Arab Shah, who was personally captured by Timur as a child and spent years in his court, recorded these events with a specificity born of proximity and hatred. Estimates from various sources describe towers numbering in the dozens, containing skulls numbering in the tens of thousands, built in locations calculated for maximum visibility. This was not the incidental brutality of an army out of control. It was architecture. The towers were a message in a medium that required no translation across any language barrier. His campaign against Delhi in 1398 began with an act of logistical ruthlessness that established the tone for everything that followed. As his army prepared for battle with the Sultan of Delhi, Timur's commanders reportedly argued that the 100,000 Hindu prisoners they had captured during the march could not be safely managed during combat. They might escape. They might be freed by a Delhi counterattack and turn on the Mongol rear. Timur's solution, recorded in the Tuzuki Timuri, a memoir attributed to him though its authenticity is disputed among historians, was to order their execution before the battle. 100,000 prisoners killed in a day as a military precaution. Delhi itself was then taken, looted with a thoroughness that reportedly left the city economically devastated for a century, and abandoned, because Timur had no interest in governing India, only in extracting everything it contained. His campaign against the Golden Horde under Toktamish was motivated by a combination of geopolitical rivalry and personal grievance, Toktamish having attacked Timur's territory after receiving his help to gain the Golden Horde throne in the first place. Timur's revenge was comprehensive. He burned Sarai, the Golden Horde capital on the Volga, dismantled the trade infrastructure that had made the Horde wealthy, and broke the organization of the Western Mongols' successor state so thoroughly that it never recovered its former coherence. At the Battle of Ankara in July 1402, Timur captured the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, one of the most powerful rulers in the contemporary Islamic world. He was a man who had been besieging Constantinople when Timur's invasion forced him to break off the siege and march east to his destruction. Bayezid died in Timurid captivity the following year. The story that Timur used him as a footstool, while repeated by later European and Ottoman sources, is generally considered apocryphal by modern historians. What is not disputed is that a reigning Ottoman sultan was held as a prisoner, that his capture threw the Ottoman Empire into a decade of civil war, and that Timur, an old man by this point, was already planning his next campaign when he died in February 1405, en route to invade China. Back in Samarkand, meanwhile, the mosques and palaces he had built with craftsmen stolen from every city he destroyed rose in blue-tiled geometric splendor. The paradox of Timur is one of history's sharpest. The most beautiful buildings of the early Islamic world were funded entirely by catastrophe. Beg Khan Jani Beg Khan. Beg Khan inherited the Golden Horde in 1313 and understood immediately that the Western successor, Khanat's primary vulnerabilities were internal, a fractured nobility with pagan and Buddhist factions resistant to central authority, and external, a network of Russian principalities that were periodically tempted to test how serious the Horde was about collecting tribute. He solved the first problem by converting to Islam and enforcing that conversion with the systematic persecution of shamanist and Buddhist Mongol nobles within his own territory, executing those who resisted with a clarity of intent that produced rapid compliance among those watching. He solved the second problem by maintaining a consistent policy of punitive raiding against any Russian prince who stepped out of line, keeping the principalities in a state of managed terror that made the tribute system function smoothly for decades. Under Beg Khan, the Golden Horde reached the apex of its power, controlling trade routes from China to the Black Sea, extracting wealth from territories stretching from Siberia to the Caucasus, and maintaining the kind of military military credibility that meant neighbors factored Mongol response into every strategic decision they made. His reign lasted until 1341, nearly 3 decades during which the horde functioned as the dominant power across the entire western steppe, a span of stable dominance that the Khanate would never again achieve after his death. His son Beg Khan, who ruled from 1342 to 1357, continued that dominance while adding a footnote to history so significant that it is difficult to fully absorb. In 1346, during the siege of the Genoese trading colony at Kaffa on the Crimean coast, an outbreak of plague had begun killing Mongols in the besieging army. Beg, according to the account of the Italian notary Gabriele de Musi, who was not present at Kaffa but wrote his account shortly after based on testimony from survivors, ordered the bodies of plague victims to be loaded onto catapults and hurled over the city walls into the Genoese colony. The Genoese reportedly threw the bodies into the sea as fast as they could, but it was not fast enough. When they eventually evacuated Kaffa by ship, they carried the disease with them. Their ships stopped at Constantinople, at Messina, at Genoa, and Venice. By 1348, the Black Death was moving through continental Europe at a speed and lethality that medieval medicine had no framework to comprehend or address, eventually killing somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's total population over the following years. Modern genomic research tracing the Black Death's genetic origin has supported the general model of a Central Asian origin and a Black Sea transmission route, lending scientific weight to what de Musi's account described. Whether Beg understood that he was weaponizing a disease in any modern epidemiological sense is unknowable. He knew the bodies were dangerous, the text implies as much, and he used that danger deliberately as a siege weapon. The consequences of that decision reshaped European civilization more thoroughly than any military campaign the Mongols ever launched against the continent. Galdan Boshugtu Khan. Galdan Boshugtu Khan is almost entirely absent from the Western popular historical imagination, which is a remarkable oversight given that he commanded the last independent Mongol empire and came closer than anyone since Timur to reversing the tide of history against the steppe nomads and their way of war. The Dzungar Khanate, a Western Mongol state built from the Oirat Confederation in what is now Xinjiang and the surrounding regions, represented the final chapter of Mongol imperial power, and Galdan, who ruled from approximately 1671 to 1697, was its most dramatic and dangerous leader. His biography begins with an incongruity that history has never quite resolved. As a young man, Galdan was sent to Lhasa to be educated as a Buddhist monk under the 5th Dalai Lama himself, receiving years of religious training at the heart of Tibetan Buddhism, before the death of his brother called him home to claim leadership of the Dzungars. He returned from that sacred education and built an army that terrorized Central Asia for 3 decades, which raises interesting questions about the relationship between spiritual formation and political violence that historians tend to note and then decline to answer definitively. His destruction of the Khalkha Mongols throughout the 1680s and 1690s was systematic and thorough, driving hundreds of thousands of refugees eastward into the territory of the Qing dynasty in waves of displacement that destabilized the entire eastern steppe. The Kangxi Emperor, it's one of the most capable rulers in Chinese imperial history, recognized Galdan as an existential threat to Qing authority over the steppe regions, and responded by personally leading military campaigns against him, a rare commitment of imperial presence to a military operation that signals how seriously the Qing took the Dzungar challenge. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Jiaomodo in 1696, one of the largest steppe battles of the early modern era, where Qing forces with superior artillery routed the Dzungar army and broke Galdan's military power. He died the following year in 1697 by causes that remain genuinely uncertain across the historical sources, with suicide, poison, and illness all appearing in different accounts. But the story of the Dzungars does not end with Galdan's death. His successors, including Tsewang Rabtan and Galdan Seren, maintained the Khanate's defiance against Qing expansion for another half-century, fighting a long and grinding conflict that finally ended not with a Mongol victory or even a negotiated peace, but with something the Qing dynasty called pacification, and that modern historians increasingly describe using a different word. Beginning in 1755, the Qianlong Emperor launched the final campaigns against the Dzungar Khanate, and what followed over the next 2 years was a destruction so complete that it stands as one of the least known major genocides of the early modern period. Qing forces killed, enslaved, or drove into flight an estimated 80% of the Dzungar population. Contemporary Qing records and modern demographic analysis both support a figure somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 people killed or dead from famine and disease as a result of the campaign. Out of a total population population estimated at around 600,000 before the final wars began. The steppe that had been Dzungar territory was described by Qing officials as emptied, a landscape without people, which was precisely what the Qianlong emperor had ordered. The Mongol story, which had begun with Genghis Khan clearing his enemies off the steppe with the logic of a man making room for something he intended to build, ended here with the steppe being cleared of Mongols themselves by an empire powerful enough to apply that same logic in reverse. 6 centuries of the most consequential violence in human history, from a cart axle measurement in the Mongolian steppe to an empty grassland in Xinjiang, and the brutality that ran through all of it was never random, never simply rage. It was always, in its own terrible way, a plan. Batu Khan. Batu Khan is the name that should haunt the nightmares of every European who has ever thanked geography for keeping their continent safe, because for approximately 18 months between 1241 and 1242, geography was not doing the job, and only the death of a man thousands of miles away in Karakoram prevented a conclusion that medieval Europe had no military means to avoid. Batu was a grandson of Genghis, given command of the westward expansion of the empire along with the irreplaceable strategic mind of Subutai, the greatest purely military general the Mongol Empire ever produced, a man who had already campaigned across Russia, the Caucasus, and Persia before the European invasion, and who approached the task of destroying European armies with the methodical patience of someone who had read the intelligence reports and found no reason to be concerned. The campaign opened with the systematic demolition of the Rus principalities beginning in the winter of 1237, a season chosen deliberately because the Mongols had identified that the frozen waterways of Russia functioned as a road network unavailable to defenders who had never thought about invasion from that direction in that weather. City after city fell on a schedule that suggested a moving timetable rather than a war, with the defenders of each settlement unable to coordinate with neighbors because the Mongols moved faster than messengers. By the time the campaign turned toward Europe proper in the spring of 1241, Batu and Subutai had divided their forces into multiple columns, operating across a front several hundred miles wide, a strategic choice that made it impossible for any single European power to concentrate its forces against the main threat, because no one could identify which column was the main threat. The Polish campaign and the Hungarian campaign ran simultaneously, and were timed to prevent the two kingdoms from reinforcing each other, a feat of coordination requiring the kind of operational planning that European military commanders of the period were not yet thinking about in those terms. After Legnica and Mohi had removed the organized military opposition, the army settled into Hungary for the winter of 1241 to 1242, and raided methodically across the country, with detachments crossing the frozen Danube to probe Austrian and Dalmatian territories, and demonstrate that the river, considered a natural defensive barrier, was not one in winter. The strategic question of what came next, whether the army would have continued westward into the German states, France, or beyond, is one of the genuine open questions of medieval history. Subutai reportedly wanted to continue. Batu had practical and political concerns about extending the campaign further from the Mongolian heartland. Ögedei's death resolved the argument by removing it. Batu spent the remainder of his life building the Golden Horde into a functioning state along the Volga, establishing Sarai as its capital, and constructing the administrative apparatus that would extract tribute from the Russian principalities for the next 2.5 centuries. The Horde under Batu functioned as a sophisticated state, with its own coinage, its own postal relay system, and its own diplomatic relationships with powers as distant as Egypt and France, a fact that tends to get lost in the emphasis on the violence of its founding. He died around 1255, having never lost a major engagement, and having reshaped the political geography of Eurasia in ways that took generations to fully manifest. The Russian word for the Mongol overlordship, the Tatar yoke, carries a weight in Russian historical memory and national identity that has not faded in 700 years, which is one measure of what Batu Khan built and what it cost the people it was built on top of. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.